Welcome to the Culture Stew podcast. I'm Maria Marukian.
And I'm Roger Moriano.
In every episode, we will meet with practitioners, authors, and all around fascinating people who share their wisdom and insights on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Roger, my head is swimming from the conversation that we just had with our phenomenal guest, and I know yours is too. I want to just quickly kind of give a bio, and then let's just talk about some of what we're processing. So,
Absolutely.
Kay Suarez is the president and chief executive officer of Equity in the Center. It is a field-wide initiative to influence social sector leaders to shift their mindsets, their practices, and the systems that they belong to, all with the focus of achieving racial equity. And one of the things that sort of put Equity in the Center on our radar is their publication, Awake to Woke to Work, Building a Race Equity Culture, which details management and operational levers that organizations can utilize to center race equity, to transform culture. It is one of the most phenomenal publications. I've learned so much from reading it and applying it with even some of our clients, but I think it's something that I constantly have to go back to the well and reread because there's so much really valuable content. And Kay is fascinating because, you know, she's her background's in management consulting, but she has really shifted her focus in the last years to be focusing on nonprofits and philanthropies and looking at ways to help them to dismantle white supremacy from the inside out. She's a coach. She's worked with social entrepreneurs of color whose work focuses on eliminating race-based disparities. She's a graduate of Harvard and the London School of Economics. She's brilliant and also just one of the most, just brings such passion and power to her work. I loved her stories, and I can't say enough about how much I learned from our brief conversation with her.
Yeah, my head is still swimming. And I think that, Kay just brought a rich array of ideas and experiences and a deep understanding of our culture, our system, our society, and how that shapes everything. And I think the important aspect of the work that Kay and her organization are doing is to really put a spotlight at the heart of the matter, right? I think that so often in this work, we have so many structural disparities that we have to address, and in different ways that these intersecting disparities affect people through their identities, through their own experiences. But Kay is really good about identifying what's at the heart of it. And she, I think, astutely points out that quite frequently, the issue of race is the most difficult one that's out there for folks to address, to acknowledge, to accept as a very real issue in our society that continues to produce outcomes that are unequal and inequitable. And so I think that the insistence that Kay has in her organization and through her work to really identify and to name race as a really foundational piece of understanding that we have to address, that we have to dismantle, is so important. And I think it'll help all of us who are doing this work to really guide us in the direction of having honest, courageous conversations with the organizations that we work with our neighbors, with our community members, to really understand what we need to do to understand that the systems under which we live, how they produce different outcomes for folks, how they have very real lasting effects that are intergenerational, and to really address it, that we have to have an acknowledgement that it's real, that it is something that's affecting all of us in subtle or in very direct ways, and that we have to be invested in the long term, as she mentioned, to lifelong learning and a lifelong understanding and commitment to these issues to really make real substantive change happen.
You mentioned courageous conversations, and one of the words that often comes to mind for me when I listen to Kay, when I read her work, and definitely from today's conversation, is she gives me the courage to stay in the fight, to continue to do my own work, to really put myself in that space of vulnerability, to call attention to white supremacy, and to encourage and hold others accountable to doing the work that's really required to dismantle these white supremacist systems that we're a part of. I think sometimes it can be easy to fall prey to the desire to maintain the status quo without realizing we're doing it. And so I'm grateful to her that she is always putting herself out there as a reminder that this work requires a deep sense of discomfort and courage to stay in the fight. So I hope for everyone who's listening that you stay in the fight, continue to learn with and from our conversations, and definitely check out Equity in the Center's work and their publication, Awake to Woke to Work. Thanks, everybody. Welcome to the show, Kay. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So we want to hear a little bit about your backstory and your why for doing this work. And so we wanted to start with a question. If you think about the messages that you received early in your life that have really shaped who you are, how you identify, your sense of the world around you, what comes to mind for you? What are some of those messages that really stand out?
That's a great question. I'd say two things come to mind when you ask that question. So first, I was raised by a mom who was first an elementary school teacher and later an elementary school principal. And she spent the majority of her career as a teacher and principal in an urban district that was almost 100% Black. And so I learned a lot about the challenges of educators in really resource constrained districts through her experience. And a big part of, I guess, her philosophy as an educator was how she maintained the school grounds in addition to rigor with academics and the culture that she cultivated in the school. But among other things, she would always have flowers in front of the school, which in an area which was somewhat blighted. It was sort of like a bright spot. And there were periods where the flowers would be pulled up or intentionally destroyed. And the cars of the teachers and the staff in the parking lot would get keyed. And so I asked her, it's like, well, why do you teach somewhere where it's so hard and where you're not welcomed as an educator? And so her response was, well, if I don't do it, then who will? Because I'm the best person to be in this position, because she did it with love, because she saw them as her kids. They looked like her, they could grow up to be her. She was them at one point, as a young Black child. And I think that stuck with me. I did not at the time really understand what she meant. I was like, well, okay, but you could go to a suburban district and not have to deal with these things. So sort of a very classist orientation on my part. So I'd say that the flip side of that is, as the only Black student in the majority of my classes, as a high school student, I didn't have a Black classmate. After freshman year, I would sit with the Black students at lunch. I sort of overwhelmingly was on this path of assimilation to succeed. And so my family really prioritized education. Like my mother and most of the women of her generation in her family were teachers. And so, education was paramount. I decided that, I picked my college when I was 9 and had my own little plan on how to get there. But generally the plan was to assimilate, to be as excellent as possible, but to assimilate to white culture to the extent that you get into the best possible school so that you can then get the best possible job. And so as I look at where I am now, I think those two messages are a part of why I am at Equity in the Center and why I think that equity in organizations and society broadly is important, because you shouldn't have to put yourself into a box to be accepted. in an organization or in society. And everything that I observed in terms of the work that my mother did, and in my experience as the only Black kid in all of my classes for the last 3 years, is about racial inequity in society. And so I think the privilege that I've had in my life economically and in terms of education has put me in a position to say things and to support folks in centering equity in organizations. And kind of like my mom said, if I don't do it, then who will? Like, I'm in a unique position to have an impact. And so that's part of why I'm at Equity in the Center.
Thank you so much for sharing that. There's a lot of your story that resonates with me. And it's interesting because there are certain things I think that we share in terms of our backgrounds. My parents were both public school educators in Detroit public schools and in the high school. And what was interesting for me growing up, being white, identifying as white, and living in a deeply segregated, metropolitan area. We lived in the predominantly white suburbs of Detroit, and my parents commuted into their high school. And a lot of the, similar challenges in terms of cars being keyed and, sort of destruction. But what I think is interesting as you were sharing your story is that a lot of yes, my parents had a lot of love for their students, but I think that there was also some deep racial prejudice that existed that was very prevalent in the way that they talked about their students. And I think especially as they got further in their careers and became more and more sort of cynical, the less connection and love they had for their students. And so that really struck me because I never thought of it that way. But I think that has led me as a white person to be on a similar trajectory in terms of saying, if I don't do this, who will, in terms of the people who look like me, right? Because I do have all of these privileges. There are so many things I've never had to think about or worry about or consider. The world has been open to me. And yet that's not enough to just sit back and say, well, I've got it, so why should I care about anyone else? But yeah, that really struck me as you were sharing that story, that there's sort of this, there's a collective experience and then a divergence because of our identities. And how can we, I think what we'd love to continue to explore in this conversation is how do we reconverge with, ensuring that people, regardless of our identities and our perspectives and our lived experiences, can see ourselves as, as champions of this work moving forward.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. And I totally get what you mean about how over time, increasing cynicism can diminish the love, because I'm assuming, and you could share more about what you think, that they were buying into the prevailing narrative on why their students and the communities in which their students lived were the way that they were. And that's what I was buying into when I was telling my mother, well, why would you choose to work somewhere where people stomp the flowers and key your car when you could go work in like a nice suburb where nobody will do that to your car? Lots of other race-related issues there, but your car won't get keyed. I was buying into the narrative about why the students and the families in the community where my mother worked were someplace where people were stomping the flowers and keying the cars. And ultimately it's because it was their fault. Because their parents weren't doing a good job. It was their fault. And I just bought into the prevailing narrative, and all of that is part of structural racism. And my mother didn't buy into that, but my mother also didn't articulate the narrative in the way that, say, I would now. Because yes, she saw herself in the kids because they were her. They were young Black children, as she was a young Black child once, and she believed in their inherent potential and their ability to overcome not their circumstances, but the system that was creating and driving their circumstances. But she didn't articulate that to me sort of in that way, but that was embedded in her. Well, if I don't do it, then who will? And so I had to learn that over time by seeing the patterns of inequity in education and society. And I think in talking to folks who have a background similar to mine, a lot of folks will say, well, there was a time when I thought that I could win. So I was going to assimilate. I was going to go to the best school possible. I was going to get the best job. I was going to excellent my way out of racism and overcome it. And many of us do win to some extent, like you get into the school you want, you get the job you want, but ultimately you're still operating within a system of structural racism and you will not win. You might get the job, you might actually become rich, but you could still be shot by the police. And when people see you, they still see the color of your skin first. And the older you get, the more you observe the patterns in society and in your own life. And that was what was embedded in my mother's statement, but I couldn't understand that because I still thought I was going to excellent my way out of racism and experiencing it in my life. And that's just not how it works.
Well, so much there, Kay, and I'm thinking about the potential for the development of internalized oppression that happens in environments like that if we don't address what's happening, if it's not talked about. And then you're right about the experience of folks thinking they could just win if they just assimilate and do what they need to do. And that's the power kind of the system, right, of whiteness, of really having a system and a culture that communicates to folks that everyone should be like us, and then you'll be successful, not recognizing the systems, first of all, that are in place that produce different experiences, different outcomes, but also different sets of barriers, right, that are not seen by folks who don't experience those barriers. So it's incredibly crucial to name these things and to talk about them to move forward and to help folks navigate a system that it was not built for you to succeed in, right? So it's very, very challenging. And you've kind of address that in some of the work that you're doing. And clearly, I think a lot of your life experience has shaped your professional path as well, based on what you're sharing. And in terms of Equity in the Center and the development of that organization and that you lead and the approach that you take to the work, how have these dynamics and these experiences that you've had and the professional approach to your work, how has that been shaped, not just by your experiences, but in the work that Equity in the Center does?
Sure. Thanks for asking that. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I got to Equity in the Center. So I started out my career in management consulting, and I kind of bounced between for-profits and nonprofits, but ultimately landed at a national charter management organization before I went to graduate school. And so after graduate school, I wanted to work at a community-based organization and ended up at one that supported children in DC public schools. And I was there for about 4.5 years. And so we had staff in several DC public schools in the most economically depressed communities, and we were aligned with education reform. So I didn't work with what would be considered like a TFA ecosystem organization, but we were aligned to the work that they did in schools. We had staff that worked alongside them. So I was part of a Black-led community-based organization that was working in partnership with national white and incredibly well-resourced education reform organization. So what I got to see was how easy it was for them to capitalize their work to save Black and Brown children simply by bringing white people in who were well-intentioned and had no connection to their communities. So I observed that over a number of years. I also experienced how difficult it was to be in a community-based organization. And so I made the decision to go back to a consulting firm that supported national nonprofits like the one I was part of as a network. And what I learned was I went from being in the community to being at 20,000 feet, and I became part of the system that was very inequitable. So I'm no longer on the front line, like in a school or supporting staff that are in schools, but I'm now part of the broader system that was capitalizing white-led organizations that were out there to save Black and Brown children, but not coming to the work, valuing them as my mother did, but thinking that they were going to discipline these children into, in a lot of cases, generating the academic outcomes that we see in predominantly white schools, for example. And so I ultimately felt like, you know what, I'm part of the problem. So I've just gone from sort of one context to another, but it's all operating within the same system of structural racism and white supremacy. And I'm not actually helping. I'm just, as a privileged Black person, facilitating and being complicit in white supremacy. And so I sort of came to that conclusion after observing a number of engagements and also experiencing, as the only full-time Black member of the team, institutional racism within the organization. And being held to a double standard where my behavior or actions that I demonstrated were considered like unfriendly and mean, where those same behaviors in a white male were observed and rewarded as leadership. And so I ultimately left and ended up focusing on equity work and landed at Equity in the Center. And I think Awake to Woke to Work, building a race equity culture and sort of the race equity cycle, the framework that illustrates how organizations shift from a focus on like representation or diversity to inclusion and ultimately to equity in terms of mitigating race-based disparities within their organization as well as in their broader work, that's the body of work I needed when I was at the consulting firm. The framework helped me to understand and it gave language to a lot of what I and many of my peers have experienced. And so for Andrew Plumley and I, we were sort of the two founding members of the team, along with Erica Hines, and Manisha Kapila was the CEO of ProInspire, where we got our start. The publication and the framework is in a way a gift to people of color in predominantly white organizations, but also just in organizations, period. A gift in terms of a language to talk about what's happening. And I didn't have that language to talk about what I was experiencing when I was in a community-based organization working alongside education reform organizations who were considered superior to mine simply because they were white-led. Or when I was at the consulting firm working with national philanthropies and nonprofits that were very much aligned to the education reform way of seeing and valuing Black children and Black communities. Because how do you talk about structural racism in the way that it is replicated in institutions? And so I hope that Awake to Woke to Work supports folks who look like me as well as their colleagues in talking about how to explicitly and intentionally dismantle an institution's complicity in structural racism and white supremacy. Because they're just, in my experience, there was never the language for it. And so we've tried to create a shared language and a set of characteristics and action steps that can guide an institution's work to mitigate racial inequities in their organizational culture and then sort of in society more broadly in terms of their external work.
Okay, I think you also have named it, just describing equity in the center and the work that you're doing. One of the core ongoing challenges that we see to making any sort of progress in this work, right? That there DEI or whatever set of acronyms that we want to use, we seem to keep falling into the place the broader, sort of society, in our organizations of perpetuating white supremacist systems by even just the approaches, right? And we saw it in the sort of the reaction in 2020, the performative, statements and allyship, and let's do training and listening sessions and put together a committee. And yes, we're very committed. And now 2023, seeing a lot of the sort of the ebb of interest and the essentially sort of termination of so many positions and offices, which often are led by people of color and particularly women of color. It seems to be this is not new, right? We keep seeing these cycles of, crisis, reaction, and then, the tide goes back out. How do we, when we think about how we can break these ongoing challenges, this sort of reinforcement of the status quo. Um, what does it take to, I guess, really encourage folks, especially leaders, people who are in positions of power and authority, to really shift to this idea of being woke at work? What does that mean? What does it really take?
Um, it's really complicated. One of the things that I will often say, when we're coaching folks or facilitating a capacity building session on race equity is that the minute you make the decision that you want to dismantle white supremacy, like at work or broader society, your next step is to then go to your toolbox of white supremacy tactics to dismantle white supremacy, because that's what we've got. So none of us actually knows what it's like to live in an equitable society. We don't know how to operationalize equity in organizations or necessarily be anti-racist in our personal lives and our communities, because there isn't a playbook for that. There are certainly lots of resources out there now, but we live in a society that was designed to be inequitable. So the minute we make the decision to, be anti-racist, let's work on equity in our organization, our first step is going to be to use all of the tools that up to that point we have used to replicate and reinforce the system, to dismantle it. And all it does is reinforce the system, while paying lip service in some cases to the values or the philosophies of anti-racism and equity. And that is a normal response for we as individuals growing up in American society, but also global society, where we're trained to perpetuate the status quo. So you have to start by conceding that, which is very difficult for folks to do. It's difficult for folks to admit that they are, as individuals, complicit in upholding white supremacy, whether they identify as white or whether they identify as people of color. And people of color, just as women are in upholding the patriarchy, people of color are critical to perpetuating white supremacy, because people of color carry the water for perpetuating white supremacy in the same way that women carry the water for patriarchy, because that's how you perpetuate the system. Women police other women's bodies more aggressively often than men do. People of color, sometimes within organizations who are assimilated, will be the ones who are the enforcers for certain characteristics or aspects of white supremacy. And what I'm not doing is blaming people of color for white supremacy or blaming women for the patriarchy. What I'm highlighting is that the system was designed to perpetuate itself. And it is really critical that people be intentional about acknowledging how complicit they are without trying and perpetuating what you said. And it can take folks years to understand that. So often when we work with people, a lot of it is about helping them understand the 4 levels at which racism operates and their complicity in it as people who identify as white or folks who identify as people of color. We as people of color are complicit in a system that oppresses us, just like women are complicit in the patriarchy that oppresses them. And it can be really difficult for folks to come to terms with how in their personal and their professional lives, they are complicit, because they don't actually understand that a lot of the tools they're taking out of the white supremacy toolkit to try to dismantle white supremacy are actually reinforcing it in some pretty critical ways. And so we often start by talking with folks about the components of the acronym DEI. So diversity, inclusion, and equity as 3 distinct concepts that build on one another. Like equity is the outcome, the absence of identity-based disparities in your organization or in society. So in your organization, it would be an absence of disparities around like compensation, investment of professional development funds, distribution of individuals from the board to the most junior level of the organization, retention and promotion rates. In broader society, it's, disparities in maternal and fetal health care, rates of incarceration, rates of education, all of those things, or like degree completion. There would be no race-based disparities in those organizational and societal data points if race equity were achieved. So equity is the outcome we're working toward. Diversity is the literal presence of people who identify in different ways. That's it. It's bean counting and box checking. Having people of diverse identities in an organization does not make an organization inclusive. So inclusion would mean valuing people of diverse identities as equally valuable and treating them as equally valuable in your organizational culture, policy, and practice, which would yield an absence of identity-based disparities in outcomes. Most people don't understand that, and they think that equity or DEI is the presence of people of color or the presence of people who identify as queer or disabled. And that is the absolute basement. It's the first step. Many of us have been part of organizations as, quote, diverse individuals who are oppressed and discriminated against on a daily basis, and made to feel that we're lucky to be there. So it's just, diversity is just the first step, and you have to develop an understanding of the broader system, the levels at which it operates, and the extent to which we as individuals of all identities are complicit in perpetuating the system. So dismantling it requires us to come up with something different and to iterate and innovate and try something new. And that newness is profoundly uncomfortable for folks. And even when people commit to equity or DEI, as most people call it, they don't actually understand what they're committing to, like the depth of transformation that is required to ultimately, over time, achieve an absence of race-based disparities. It means going about and thinking about who is capable, qualified, and credible to lead in a very different way, and working through the different expectations of individuals of color in leadership. So you mentioned, Maria, that it's mostly women of color in these roles leading equity initiatives and now losing their jobs, because we were often assumed to, it's like, well, you're here, so you should lead the diversity work or the equity work. And then there are folks like me who want to do it because we want to get folks free. And what that means is that those of us in those roles have a set of expectations that white folks who held our roles previously, or who were on paper or, informally responsible for diversity, that they were never held to. I'm held to a standard as a Black woman that my white peers are not. I'm held to a standard by other Black people, and I'm held to a different standard by white folks. Like, what is demanded of me immediately, like yesterday, the transformation that I should like magic out of nothing, is drastically different in an equity context and just in any context, because I could be a CFO or a CEO or like a line worker, and what's expected of me is very different than what would be expected of my white peer. So that replication of the pyramid of human value and implicit bias, all that stuff is baked into how we work together in organizations. So part of building a race equity culture is naming that, acknowledging it, unpacking it, and then coming up with specific sets of policies and practices to undo it on a daily basis, which is constant learning for all of us, because we're all programmed to replicate the system, even as we say we want to dismantle it.
I was thinking about how, as you said that, your organization specifically says that it explicitly takes a race equity approach in the work that you do, right? And I think part of it's making so much sense as to why you do that, because as you explained, so many folks in organizations don't understand the work. And then when you start getting deeper into the work, a lot of folks, particularly white folks, start to get uncomfortable with some of the stuff that's being either discussed, or some of the training or education that's happening, or some of the policies and practices that might be implemented, partly because it might be disrupting the narrative of what they think their society is or was supposed to be, but also maybe because the implementation of some of these practices is suddenly producing a mirror that people are seeing themselves in. And if they are getting uncomfortable and doing everything they can to avoid the conversation of what is at the root of many of our organizational dynamics, particularly when it comes to race, then focusing on race equity explicitly has to happen, because it keeps the conversation on the table. It forces organizations to not avoid the heart of the issue that might be impacting organizations or communities. And that is the necessary work required to really move us forward, right? So we're going to have to deal with that discomfort for folks in order to truly produce equity. And what that means is a true environment where everyone feels respected, valued, and that they have every opportunity everyone else has. So I can understand very much why you focus on race equity to produce that race equity culture. And can you share in that work how you've seen that affect leaders or affect the organization? Have you seen successes there? And how has it inspired perhaps some folks to take action and to work through the uncomfortableness to get to the point where they're like, okay, I can do this, right? I can actually stand for the things that we need to do.
Sure, thanks. I think when folks engage with equity in the center, like they go through our training and they get an understanding of everything that you just said, they can then pivot to action. And part of our value proposition, or what's different about our approach, or kind of the intent of our body of research, was to help people make the pivot that you just described. So to develop an awareness that just simply having diverse folks around or hired is not sufficient to yield equity. And so to force them to look harder and to keep race at the center, because race is the biggest driver of disparities. And if we don't name it explicitly, it'll fall off the table and we'll talk about gender or sexual orientation or anything but race. So we're centering race because it's the biggest driver of disparities. Race equity work done well is necessarily intersectional. It doesn't mean that your identity as a queer person or a disabled person or a first-generation American or a woman doesn't count. All of that is embedded in race, and we encourage folks to disaggregate their data within organizations and look at all those data points that I talked about, so like compensation, retention, promotion, and to disaggregate them all by identity. The data will direct you to the points of intersection. Race is always the biggest driver of disparities, particularly in predominantly white organizations. If you have a predominantly POC, or for example, a predominantly Black organization, often the biggest disparity is around gender. But when you look at society broadly, when you look at organizations in the nonprofit and the for-profit sector, the biggest disparities are around race. So that's why we center race. So when folks adopt our approach, like center race and work toward beginning to build a race equity culture over years, there's a lot of education that's required, but what it does cultivate is a sense of responsibility and accountability to do better and to change your internal organizational culture and your external facing work to name what you just went through, Roger. So the broader system of white supremacy and structural racism, our historical role in it, and what we can do today inside of our organization and in our external work to mitigate that. That's the first step we find often. So folks get to an understanding of the system, so to speak, their role in it. They name a commitment to dismantling white supremacy or to being actively anti-racist. But as Maria said, a lot of people did this back in 2020. And then they realize how difficult that is to achieve. So you see the retrenchment that's happened in the last year or so. I mean, this, SCOTUS kind of being the most extreme example of the walk back. And there are organizations that have doubled down into that discomfort and continue to do the hard work. So it takes years. We support organizations in building a race equity culture as capacity builders. And now as an independent 501c3, we have to build a race equity culture in our own institution. We as human animals are slow on the uptake. You have to learn and then apply skills to mitigate inequities over and over and over again, and provide folks with coaching and support and a community to talk about how other folks are approaching it so you can use those insights in your own work. So we've definitely seen organizations begin the transformation. Sometimes it begins by shifting the level of diversity in the organization overall, or shifting the level of diversity in their C-suite or in their leadership team. That isn't always the first step. It can start at other levels of the organization in terms of an increase in diversity. But as I said, diversity is the first step. So the really critical part is the creation of a learning agenda that is designed to support individuals, teams, and the institution in mitigating inequities in their daily work. So it's a commitment to years of learning. So often when we work with folks after they've done our initial training, so getting up to speed on what's in the publication, and then we do coaching, for a period of months after that, what we spend most of our time talking about is identifying and creating a learning agenda for the institution. So what are the things that members of the team need to learn to reframe how they do their work and to center equity in their practice. So it's beginning with thinking about like the 4 levels at which racism operates, sort of the history of structural racism and how it's shown up in our society, and then pulling the thread from those historical practices to your work in your community in the present day. So for example, like we were talking about the community my mom worked in, the community that Maria's parents worked in. So why does the community look that way? Why do all Black people live here? Well, it's about redlining. So making those historical connections between law and policy to what we see today, and then how our institution replicates and contributes to that. Because, for example, with philanthropy, philanthropy has never really, prior to the past few years, and people would say even now, this isn't the commitment. Philanthropy hasn't set about committing to dismantle the systems that make people vulnerable. Philanthropy has been committed to charity, to giving money to vulnerable communities to help them out, scholarships, whatever the money can help, whatever gaps the money can help fill. But what philanthropy hasn't committed to do is dismantle the system that created philanthropy and gave the folks who are setting up these foundations all of that wealth, which was built on the backs of people of color and on stolen land. So sort of pulling that thread from the history of our country and our communities to where we sit in community today, and how those systems are replicated inside of organizations by saying, it's like, well, this individual deserves to be CEO because they have this resume, and we consider them more credible to make decisions about grants or programs that support vulnerable communities because they're the most educated or, have an Ivy League degree, as opposed to someone who may have grown up in the community and have a profile that looks somewhat different. So it's having a really hard conversation about what we as institutions value in leaders, and in institutions, and how these patterns of disparities have played themselves out, not just in who's selected to lead in institutions, in teams, who gets grants, who's allowed to get a grant to run a program in their own community and why, and how the bias that all of us hold about who is capable and credible to lead has infected everything that we do. So it's a lot to unpack. I don't know if that's been necessarily clear, but there are organizations that have made a really impressive start at dismantling their complicity in white supremacy. And it starts with education, and then developing what we call like a race equity action plan and a system of accountability, so that people are learning, applying, being supported in applying their new knowledge, and in demonstrating different behaviors that achieve outcomes that over time mitigate race-based disparities. And so that's what you want to keep your eye on, is the narrowing of race-based disparities over time, and backwards mapping into organizational policy, practice, process, and culture that supports that. And that the absence of that orientation is what we feel supports folks in really missing the mark and focusing on diversity. It's like, well, we have, 40% folks of color, on the team, or, in our grant portfolio or whatever. But when you look at the outcomes that you're working toward in your community or in your own team, there are still significant disparities. And so what has to change in order to close those gaps? And often folks don't want to give up power. And that's embedded in a lot of what Roger was saying before about like, well, then I have to think about like what my role is and how I got here. And that's not work that makes people excited. And the intention of building a race equity culture or cultivating principles and practices of anti-racism is not guilt, because that is not productive. So I think in our work and the work of our colleagues, our goal is not to make anyone feel guilty about what they have or the role that they hold, but to support them in becoming increasingly aware of the privilege and the advantage that systemically supported them in attaining certain things, and their responsibility to dismantle a system that advantages some and disadvantages others, like to this day. So what's your responsibility in that context? How can you change the institution that you lead or where you work? And how would things look different if leadership were more inclusive, if your process, your practices, your culture were more inclusive, if the way you valued people and programs wasn't built on this pyramid of human value that has been the underpinning of our society for centuries.
I have so many threads I want to pull from everything you just said, Kay, and I know we're short on time, but a couple of things I wanted to note and kind of follow up with you on a little bit. So one of, I think, my grievances in doing this work as a practitioner is the notion of meeting people where they are, and yet at the same time finding the balance between that empathy that everybody's on a journey and we're all starting at different places, with the need to hold individuals accountable, especially the more power, the more privilege, the more authority you have, the more accountability and sense of ownership in many ways one should have about dismantling these systems. But I also recognize that, like, I don't know, if you had asked me 10 years ago, I probably would have said I was very awake and woke and doing the work. And yet I look back now and realize just how little I did know about myself and about those systems. And so I really appreciate what you were saying about the need for us to build continuous learning into this process, and that every single one of us has that need to continue to learn and to flex those muscles. Otherwise they atrophy, even if we do have some of that awareness. And yet at the same time, I also find, and I don't know if you do too, that there is a deep sense of fatigue that people are experiencing for various reasons, right? In, thinking specifically from a racial lens, a lot of white folks feeling fatigued. They're like, well, didn't we do enough already? Like, we've made progress. We're, aren't we good? Like, we're better than we were before? Aren't we doing okay? Like, how much more effort are we supposed to put into this? And people of color, right, especially Black folks, fatigue because they're like, I am tired of trying to either be the sole representative and continuously tell you that it's not enough, or to have to constantly do that assimilation and code switching to continue to reinforce white people's comfort in the learning process. And so I'm wondering, how are you dealing with the fatigue that maybe you and your peers are experiencing in being at the forefront of leading these efforts, but also how do you manage those that you are providing these services to when their fatigue is also perhaps getting in the way of progress?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And we will often say, when we introduce people to the framework, that fatigue is part of the process. And as you think about building a race equity culture and creating a learning agenda, you have to leave space for people to recover from the intensity of the experience while also persisting. So I think for Black and Brown, Indigenous folks who are at the forefront of holding space for people to learn, what I do at Equity in the Center and what I see my peers doing is trying to prioritize their wellness and their wholeness so that they can continue to do the work. So Equity in the Center, for example, has a 4-day work week. We hold really firm boundaries around taking on new work, because if you run yourself into the ground, then you're done and you're not doing anything to help anybody because you're sick. So I think for practitioners, BIPOC practitioners, prioritizing their wellness, creating a work schedule that gives them space to recover, and their team space to recover has been really critical. And the increased adoption of the 4-day work week, the organizational pauses that are on our calendar, on the calendar of many of our peers, and the really firm boundaries around taking on new work, as well as within the execution of the work, having firm boundaries around what I will and will not do or say or hold. When we first started Equity in the Center, Andrew and I, we're facilitating on an almost daily basis. And some of the conversations would be so hard that at the end of it, we'd be like, this is going to kill us. There's a physical toll to racism, period, and that's weathering. But those of us who do this work are weathered in the process. And so you have to create a schedule and a process that allows you to recover from that so you can persist. And so I prioritize that for myself, for the team, and I see my colleague practitioners doing that increasingly. The fatigue that white folks and BIPOC folks of privilege feel, because they do feel it too. I will often say, you know, slavery lasted for about 250 years. The theft of indigenous land goes back century, and the genocide of indigenous people goes back centuries before that. So it is not logical to assume that in 24 months, we will have unwound centuries of structural oppression. Like, full stop. It defies logic to think that we would have done a couple of years of work to undo all of that oppression. And so, yes, you feel tired, but like, how tired are Black mothers of raising their Black sons and at, you know, ages 5, 6, 7, giving them lessons on how not to be shot by the police? You know, I am still, as a person of significant privilege, conscious of being shot by the police. And it's interesting in speaking to white colleagues, or sometimes when I'm facilitating with white folks, they will express surprise that I experience or think about those things. I am still Black. And I think speaking to like the reality of what that means in the present, and the difference between your position and mine, if you have a different identity, if you identify as white in the present, can help to highlight the tension between your fatigue and mine. So if you want to step back, that is your privilege. And I, as a Black person of privilege, I have the space to step back in a way that the majority of folks who identify as Black don't. And so I will often use myself as an example, like how I, over decades, as you were saying, Maria, have become aware of my own privilege, how that's embedded in why I do this work and how I do this work. So I will use sort of my increasing awareness of my own complicity in white supremacy as an example for others when I'm facilitating. And what that does is it positions it so that I'm not attacking you. So here's how I was complicit in white supremacy, in terms of my management of other Black people, in terms of the values that I espoused, in terms of who I thought was capable and credible to lead, including Black and brown folks. Because if you're not assimilated, then you're not capable or credible to lead. So using myself as much as I can as an example. But with the fatigue for white folks, yeah, it's real. It is pretty devastating to consider one's own complicity in white supremacy, and that you could have gone through life for decades sheltered from the reality of what racism is, but that's the desired outcome. So you shouldn't feel guilty about the decades that you were not aware. What can you do today and in the days moving forward to be anti-racist, to hold yourself and your community accountable? Like, think about from today onward. But the whole point, one of the many points of racism, is there's this element of like, the emperor has no clothes. You were never supposed to know that this is how it works. And so that's why you were just walking around clueless. And I was also clueless to a significant extent. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And so now that you know, what can you do? And build in pauses in your learning. So when you're creating a learning agenda for an institution, we always say, like, you know, don't schedule 4 back-to-back super intense racial learning experiences. Like, people will collapse. And there are people who leave the organization who say, I can't take it anymore. We all have heard of the instances where people have filed lawsuits. Like, we're human animals, and you have to take into account our ability to absorb things. And that goes for folks who identify as white and folks who identify as Black, brown, indigenous folks of color, because we also are devastated by going into a series of meetings that talk about how our people have been oppressed and killed over centuries. And so you've got to think about that and work with coaches and capacity builders to hold space for people to learn, to absorb and reflect, and then move forward, and being really intentional about that so that you don't burn folks out or end up having a really tense conversation or interaction that sets the work back because people are harmed, and then everyone's afraid to talk about it again. And in those spaces, people of color are harmed and white folks experience harm. It's a very different type of harm, but the result is that no one wants to do the work anymore. And so it's important for practitioners to hold intentional space to ensure that that doesn't happen. And that's one reason why when we talk to folks, we're like, the folks you hire to hold space for these conversations are really important, because if you get someone who doesn't hold space that is not harmful, that's not going to help anybody get free. It's not going to help folks be anti-racist, because people are just going to be harmed and upset and guilty or angry. And so the degree of intentionality that is required is significant. And so often when facilitators or teams come in, it's a multiracial team. Folks who have different identities hold space for different conversations, sometimes in affinity space, to help folks process all the things that come up and the fatigue that arises as a result of this. Because when I think about what my white colleagues say to their white peers, it's very different than what I'm saying now, because a white person can hold another white person accountable in a way that I never can. And that's one reason why it's important to do affinity work.
Ooh. Take a deep breath here. Yeah, I think there's so much to what you said, and there are so many questions I still want to ask. But as we close out, I'm curious if you wouldn't mind just sharing, because so much of what you said is the reality for so many folks, and we are dealing with and working through these issues in a world that continues to push back. Right, it's resisting. As you said, the system is working as it should because it's resisting the effort to be more inclusive, right? And we're seeing the pushback. We're seeing, you said earlier, you weren't supposed to know, right, that this is the way the system works. And I think that's a strong reality in our society, such that we're seeing, states and governors pushing back on this learning because you weren't supposed to know, right? And so I guess as we close out, Kay, in this work, many of us that do this work have heard that this work is now being deemed harmful, right? It's being deemed divisive. Again, the gatekeeping language that's being used to keep us from really doing the work. As you move forward, and as we all move forward, what I guess messages do you have for our listeners that inspires hope for you? What gives you hope? What gives you hope in this work to sustain yourself and continue to insist upon creating the world that we know is out there for us and can be had if we just stay persistent? But what gives you hope and strength to move forward?
Well, thanks for that question. That's a great note to end on. I do have hope. When I think about just the work that I do every week and the conversations that I'm having, SCOTUS ruling, retrenchment and fatigue notwithstanding, they are still, 200% different than the conversations I was having in, say, 2019. And they are happening with a broader group of folks. Still a relatively small percentage of, say, all of society or all of nonprofits or all of organizations. But without question, there has been a significant increase in the number of individuals and organizations having the conversation like we're having today across the country, the retrenchment notwithstanding, because there was a huge spike, it then fell off, but we're still at a higher level of awareness and action than we were before. So I think that gives me hope. There's absolutely a retrenchment, because given everything that we just said, why wouldn't there be? I'm tired of, and I mean, I've been in sessions with this where someone's like, well, haven't I thought about this enough? I just want to go back to the way that it was before. That's a natural response within a system of white supremacy. So that was expected. I know that, and my colleagues and I have talked about this, we know we are in a better place in terms of the number of people talking about these issues and trying than we were prior to the tragic murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and sort of the uprising, so to speak, or the reckoning, I say, so to speak. There was an absolute uprising. The reckoning wasn't complete, but there is absolutely an increase in awareness and action. So that gives me hope. I was part of a conversation a couple of months ago with a group of wealthy white families who were thinking about how to redistribute their wealth. And that conversation gave me hope. A relatively small universe of folks, but it is possible for individuals who identify as white, for individuals of color who have privilege within a system of white supremacy, to become aware of the matrix, to see that the emperor has no clothes, and to understand that redistributing some of my wealth to the people from whom it was stolen does not threaten me, because all of my money is actually in a different account and it has no bearing on my lifestyle. So I can release the money that's in these endowments and in these funds and distribute it in a different way. And Mackenzie Scott has been a great example of that. And that actually is not a threat to me because of white supremacy. I'm going to be okay. And so I will try to do my part to dismantle the system and to redistribute the wealth in a way that's very different than the way that permitted my family to accrue it over generations. And so that gives me hope. But so do my everyday conversations with individuals like yourselves and organizations who are trying to center equity and be explicit about our collective complicity in it. So things are better in terms of the degree of awareness and action, and that absolutely makes me hopeful. We're sadly at a point in American history where there's been an autocratic regime that has shifted kind of the public narrative. And so that's what we're up against. But there are absolutely more of us sort of on the ground fighting for race equity and justice and gender equity and justice than there were in previous years, despite what you might hear on the news.
Okay, Suarez, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, and your hope. I've learned so much from this conversation, and I wish we had more time. We just have to have you back, I guess, if you're willing.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the wonderful questions and discussion.
Thank you for listening to Culture Stew. In a world full of podcasts, we are so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Marukian.
And me, Roger Moriano.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global Consulting? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com and send us your stories or your questions at culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And remember to please give us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform.
See you next time.